Today, we are diving deep into a prophetic puzzle that has, believe it or not, stumped scholars for centuries. It's a cryptic profile of a mysterious ruler tucked away in the book of Daniel. So let's see if we can piece this ancient mystery together.
So the big question is this: who is the ungodly king that's described in Daniel chapter 11? I mean, for thousands of years, interpreters have debated the identity of this powerful, arrogant figure. He's kind of like a historical phantom. But the interpretation we're going to explore today claims to have finally found the man behind the prophecy. All right, the passage we're talking about is Daniel 11, verses 36 through 45. And what it gives us is this really detailed, but also really enigmatic, profile of a king who's located right in the Holy Land. This is a ruler who acts with absolute authority and basically sets himself against every known power, both on earth and in the heavens. And just look at how specific these clues are. The text tells us this king does whatever he wants, he thinks he's greater than any god, and he dismisses something called the desire of women. We'll get to that. He also honors a god of strongholds, gets tangled up in a war between the great powers of his day, and then ultimately meets a lonely end. These are the puzzle pieces we've got to work with.
Okay, so before we get to the proposed solution, we really need to do a little detective work. You know, the key to finding the right answer, at least according to this interpretation, is first understanding why the usual suspects, well, they just don't quite fit the profile. So let's take a look at the lineup.
Historically, four main candidates have been put on the table. The first one is Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a Greek king who persecuted the Jews. The others are a bit more symbolic: the Roman papacy, a future end-times figure people often call the Antichrist, or even the entire line of Roman emperors. Let's start with Antiochus. Right off the bat, this interpretation points out a huge contradiction. The prophecy says the ungodly king fights against the king of the north. But here's the thing. Historically, Antiochus was the king of the north. He can't be fighting himself, right? And that simple fact seems to disqualify him from the running.
So what about the papacy or a future Antichrist? Well, these interpretations usually read the text symbolically. For example, some suggest the desire of women refers to clerical celibacy. The main critique here is that this approach kind of disconnects the prophecy from the very specific historical and geographical markers Daniel gives us, pushing its fulfillment way off into the future.
So, if it's not any of the usual suspects, who is it? This is where our source presents its big idea, arguing that the answer has been hiding in plain sight this whole time, right in the pages of history and the New Testament. The proposed solution to this 2,000-year-old puzzle is none other than Herod the Great. Yep, the infamous king of Judea who was ruling at the time of Jesus' birth.
Now, this idea isn't entirely new. It actually builds on the work of earlier scholars like Philip Morrow and James Farquharson. The author we're looking at states that their argument for Herod makes far more sense than anyone else's. So this explainer is really a deep dive into that very compelling case.
So, does the case actually hold up? Well, this is where we get to match those prophetic clues from the initial profile with the historical record of Herod's life. And according to this view, the fit is, well, it's remarkably precise.
Okay, so first, this interpretation points to a hidden literary pattern in the text itself, a 7-part structure called a chiasm, where the ideas actually mirror each other. You see how it begins and ends with the king's godlessness and his lack of a helper? This structure is proposed as a perfect map of the major phases of Herod's career.
Let's look at that first clue, the king's arrogance. The prophecy says he exalts himself above every god. Well, historically, Herod did exactly that. He placed a golden Roman eagle on the Jewish temple, a huge act of blasphemy. And then there's that cryptic phrase, the desire of women. This reading says that's a messianic title, referencing the promise that the Messiah would be a descendant of a woman. And what did Herod famously do? He tried to kill that infant Messiah in Bethlehem.
And what about honoring a god of strongholds? This isn't seen as some literal deity. Instead, it's interpreted as an obsession with power itself, specifically Roman military and political power. And this idea, well, it just brilliantly illustrates Herod's whole career. He was a master builder of incredible fortresses like Masada and Caesarea, and he glorified Roman power because that's what kept him secure.
The prophecy also puts this king right in the middle of a huge war between the king of the south and the king of the north. This lines up perfectly with the Actian War in 31 BC. See, Herod was allied with Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. They were the south. They were defeated by Octavian, who would become Caesar Augustus, representing the power of Rome, the north. After the battle, Herod, being the shrewd politician he was, switched his allegiance to the winner, Octavian, to save his own throne.
Towards the end of his life, the prophecy says the king will be troubled by reports from the east and from the north. Think about the end of Herod's reign. What was the report from the east? It was the arrival of the Magi, announcing the birth of a new king of the Jews, which the Bible says troubled Herod greatly. And from the north, constant political scheming from Rome, where his own sons were conspiring against him. The parallels here are just striking.
So the historical fit seems really strong. But why does any of this even matter? Well, the argument is that recognizing Herod as this ungodly king unlocks a much deeper understanding of his role in the entire biblical story. It's not just about solving a puzzle, it's about seeing a much larger pattern at play. To really get this, we need to understand a concept called biblical typology. Basically, it's the idea that certain people or events in the Old Testament act as a kind of blueprint, or a type, that foreshadows a more significant person or event later on. You could almost think of it as history rhyming.
And within this framework, Herod becomes the ultimate fulfillment of several of these negative types. He is the final Saul, the wicked king trying to kill God's true anointed one. As an Edomite, a descendant of Esau, he represents the false brother, a constant enemy to Israel. And finally, he is the ultimate Amalek, that archetypal foe who always attacks right after a moment of great deliverance.
So, we've gone from a cryptic prophecy to a specific historical king, and then all the way to a profound theological pattern. By identifying Herod the Great as Daniel's ungodly king, this interpretation doesn't just solve an ancient riddle, it suggests that history itself might be the primary language of prophecy. And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating question. What other ancient mysteries could be unlocked, not by looking to the distant future, but by looking more closely at the past?